Art jeweler Peggy Johnson began her career in Philadelphia and owned her first house on South Street in the 1970s. Anyone who spent time in that neighborhood during that time will remember what a hive of creative activity it was. I attended the Philadelphia College of Art in 1968 and 69 and lived in Philadelphia again in the early 1970s. Although our paths didn't cross at that time, I do remember the stimulating creative environment of those years, which also saw political and cultural upheaval not unlike today. Peggy grew up on a farm in southern New Jersey. She was the eldest of 4 siblings and said about her childhood, "I grew up in a home where I was encouraged to make things. This form of play creation is still a part of my work. It's fun to figure out new ideas and then turn them into actual objects. Each piece of jewelry that I make comes from a story and tells a story that I hope gets across to the viewer and reminds them of a memory they might have." Peggy attended Bloomfield College in northern New Jersey, where she was an English major with a minor in art history. Post-graduation, she spent 3 years working for an architectural magazine, but began making jewelry on the side for family and friends. Initially self-taught, her early jewelry shows her love of language, which is reflected in word plays, idioms, and everyday expressions that appear stamped onto her jewelry forms. A note from a 1974 sketchbook entry worries, "Oh dear, the words and the objects are getting all mixed up. Sometimes there are more words than objects." Peggy took advantage of workshops in Philadelphia College of Art, Kulik Stark Enameling School in New York City, Peters Valley, Haystack, Interlochen, and Maine College of Art. She also shared with many colleagues around emerging techniques and advice from the field. She first sold her work at small and inexpensive local markets in Philadelphia, then moved up to the legendary Rhinebeck Craft Fair. As her success grew, she applied for and was admitted to the American Craft Council shows. She then had many years of exhibiting at the Baltimore ACC show. At the shows, she met retail gallery owners who purchased both her wholesale lines and her one-of-a-kind work. She kept many of these relationships throughout her career, most notably with the iconic Works Gallery in Philadelphia until it closed. Some of her pieces can still be seen on pages of the Freehand Gallery in Los Angeles and Creative Metalsmiths in North Carolina. She also sold work through the Turtle Gallery in Deer Isle, Maine, and through Maine Crafts Association events for many years. Peggy's career trajectory coincided with 2 prominent innovations in the handmade jewelry field: the emergence of the RT blanking system, originated by Roger Taylor in 1980, and the creation of the benchtop hydraulic press by Lee Marshall in 1990. I was introduced to the blanking system in Scotland, where I was in residence at Highland Craft Point in Bewley, Inverness-shire, in 1981. I became very excited about this simple and accessible die-making possibility, but when I returned to the U.S. a year later, I found it hadn't made its way across the Atlantic, and acquiring the presses needed to blank out the dies was more difficult than it was in post-industrial Scotland, where a fly press could be exchanged for a bottle of whiskey in Glasgow. It took until the 1990s when Lee Marshall developed the Bonnie Doon press and then collaborated with Susan Kingsley for the combination of this mechanical tool with dies handmade by the jeweler to be embraced by the metal community. In 1993, Susan published Hydraulic Die Forming for Jewelers and Metalsmiths. The significance of a relatively low-tech die-making process to the craft jeweler was enormous. Machined dies were extremely expensive, and the jewelry trade needs the flexibility of being able to change designs according to consumer tastes. Having a low-cost way to make duplicate shapes that previously would have needed to be sawn from sheet metal allowed jewelers to consider more ambitious designs and decrease the time devoted to creating wholesale inventory. Die forming of parts that would have taken much longer to create through repoussé processes similarly freed the jeweler from a repetitive and time-consuming task. Peggy used these developments to good advantage in the creation of her 2 signature lines, insect jewelry and house wearables. Peggy wrote about the origins of her house wearable collection. This house wearables jewelry collection began in 1982. Ideas came from moving into a home of my own and from cleaning out my family house. I ran across gadgets and appliances from my past and present. Memories of them reminded me of favorite foods and festive times. Ideas began to pose themselves as pieces of jewelry, which eventually became the toaster pin, and then the utensil earrings and necklaces. From there, my involvement grew in presenting items used in everyday living, things found in the home that are transformed into wearable art. After a time of making jewelry inspired by the kitchen, I started making pieces having to do with home improvement, pets and pests, and fast food. Along with the house wearable collection, Peggy created pins and necklaces that honored the essential tasks of daily life, such as cooking. The house wearable collection was often displayed and photographed on dollhouse furniture, and we have examples of these displays in the exhibition. She was often commissioned to make pieces for special occasions. When the singer Bobby McFerrin was to perform as the conductor of an orchestra in San Francisco, his wife commissioned a pin for him that read, "Maestro." Peggy's insect bodies were formed using the hydraulic press and acrylic or brass hand-cut die forms. The many small wings and appliance parts were produced from hand-cut steel blanking dies. All the parts were meticulously soldered together. No parts were cast because she didn't enjoy cleaning up castings, in her words. Her life growing up on the farm in New Jersey had given Peggy an observant eye for the farm's tiniest occupants, the insect life. Her fascination with the world of bugs led to a series of insect-inspired jewelry. She was particularly fond of beetles: the violin beetle, the cicada, the tortoise beetle, the leaf-footed beetle, the scarab beetle. An interview written by Carl Little in Ornament magazine in 1999 described her fascination with insects. He wrote, "Johnson recalls gathering caterpillars, feeding them sugar gum tree leaves, and watching them develop into beautiful Luna moths. I love insects so much," she explains. "People just don't seem to understand them. I'm disappointed not to be able to share the emergence of Brood 10 with Peggy. She made many cicada pieces, which she also chose for interpretation in metal because the cicada is a symbol of resurrection." Eventually, there was somewhat of a merging of these two collections when beetles appeared carrying garden trowels and other domestic items. Both in Philadelphia and in Portland, Peggy was supportive of community organizing, particularly community policing. She had some experience with this in her Philadelphia neighborhood, but when she purchased a house in the Munjoy Hill neighborhood of Portland in 1991, she became much more active. In fact, so active that she was invited to participate on a panel with Hillary Clinton about community policing. The exhibition also includes a thank you note to Peggy from Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, George Mitchell, in which he thanks her for the gift of a potato tie tack and says, "I look forward to wearing my vegetables." The other half of this exhibition is an installation of work by 4 jewelers and metalsmiths currently working in Maine, who received the generous donation of some of Peggy's tools. Shelby Goldsmith installed this legacy part of the exhibition beautifully and wrote the following statement. "Legacy shows the work of 4 artists who inherited some of Peggy Johnson's tools and equipment after her death. Metalsmiths have been using the same types of hand tools for ages, and though they may accumulate some rust over time, they remain useful to the next generation of makers who choose this path. Legacy is present in the field of metalsmithing and jewelry in the way knowledge, tools, techniques, and traditions are passed down, keeping the craft alive. Legacy serves to mark each of our places in this lineage and to celebrate Peggy's contribution to it. A legacy is thought to be something that's crafted with intention, and sometimes it is. However, leaving behind a legacy is not optional. We shape it every day with our words and actions and in the things we make and leave behind. Our estate is part of our legacy, but it goes far beyond just our things. I invite you to consider your own legacy. How have you planned for it? How do you want to be remembered? What non-material things will you leave behind? What are some next steps you can take towards crafting your legacy? Do you have a plan for your estate? If you are an artist, what will happen with your artwork? Special thanks to the family of Peggy Johnson who generously allowed us to have her tools. They will continue to be put to good use in our hands.